The jungle was always alive at night. Crickets screamed from the shadows, branches creaked overhead, and the thick canopy swallowed moonlight so completely that Japanese patrols often felt as though they were walking through the inside of a closed fist. Darkness was familiar. Darkness was predictable. Darkness hid them from American scouts, masked their movements, and gave them the confidence to slip between lines unnoticed. But on the night the Americans used the walking barrage for the first time, darkness betrayed them. A Japanese patrol of 15 men crept along a narrow ridge overlooking a valley. Their orders were simple: observe American movement, report any sign of artillery buildup, and avoid confrontation. The men moved in disciplined silence. Their boots sank into soft mud. Sweat dripped down their necks. Each man listened intently for the sound of American activity beyond the distant tree line. What they heard instead was something far more unsettling. A deep, rolling thunder far away at first, then slowly growing louder. The patrol paused. The sergeant raised his fist, signaling silence. The men crouched, rifles at the ready, eyes scanning the darkness. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't aircraft. It wasn't anything they recognized immediately. It was steady, rhythmic, unnatural. The sergeant frowned. Artillery, he whispered, but artillery did not sound like this. Normal artillery came in single bursts, sudden and sharp, separated by pauses. This was different, closer to a continuous roar, like 1,000 drums beating in slow unison. A faint flash illuminated the horizon. Then another. Then another. Evenly spaced, calculated. One private shifted nervously. "Sir, it's coming this way." The sergeant wanted to correct him. Artillery did not come this way. Artillery exploded at a target. It didn't move across terrain like a living thing. But as the flashes grew closer together, the sergeant realized the private might be right. The Americans weren't firing at a fixed point. They were firing in motion. A creeping, advancing tide of explosions. It was a walking barrage. The Japanese patrol had heard rumors of it from veterans who fought in Burma, stories of Allied artillery that didn't attack a position, but instead marched across the battlefield like an invisible formation of iron boots, crushing everything in its path. Most assumed the stories were exaggerations. Artillery couldn't walk. It was impossible. The logistics alone would be absurd. But now, watching the glow creep across the valley, they realized the impossible was becoming real. The patrol backed away from the ridge just as the first explosion struck the far edge of the valley. The entire jungle floor erupted with a violent burst of orange light, sending shockwaves of dirt, leaves, and shattered wood into the air. The sound hit them an instant later, a brutal, concussive blast that rattled their teeth and pounded their chests. The sergeant gestured for retreat, but before the men could move, another explosion detonated slightly closer. Then another. Then another. Always evenly spaced. Always advancing. It was like watching someone paint destruction across the jungle floor in slow, deliberate strokes. The Japanese soldiers froze in disbelief. Artillery had always been powerful but never predictable. American fire was usually scattered or responsive, called in to hit specific coordinates. This was different. This was controlled. This was methodical. This was terrifying. The barrage kept coming. Trees snapped like bones. Boulders shattered. The ground trembled with each detonation. The Japanese patrol scrambled backward as the explosions marched up the valley wall. Vines were thrown into the air like torn rope. A cloud of dirt billowed upward, glowing orange with reflected fire. The sergeant forced his men into a shallow depression behind an uprooted log, pushing them down with both hands. "Stay low," he shouted, though his voice was barely audible over the next blast. The explosions now formed a steady wall of fire, creeping forward at a pace that matched the advance of infantry. It was as if the Americans had synchronized the earth itself to their march. The barrage didn't pause, it didn't waver, it didn't give the defenders a moment to reposition or regroup. The private beside the sergeant buried his face in the dirt, shaking. "How can they fire like this?" he gasped. "How do they control it?" The sergeant didn't know. Neither did any Japanese soldier who witnessed it. Behind the barrage, unseen but inevitable, American infantry moved forward in wide formation. The explosions shielded them completely. Any Japanese soldier who attempted to fire through the advancing wall of destruction would be consumed by it before he even saw the Americans' faces. The walking barrage wasn't just a tactic. It was a psychological weapon. It created a moving zone of annihilation that erased the boundary between offense and defense. It turned terrain into a conveyor belt of destruction, where every inch of ground was swallowed by fire exactly once and then abandoned to ash. The patrol clung to the earth, waiting for the barrage to pass, but the sergeant realized something horrifying. It wasn't passing, it was climbing. The explosions were now moving up the ridge toward them. "Retreat, move," he shouted. The men scrambled to their feet and bolted into the jungle. Branches slapped their faces, roots caught their boots. The air shook with each explosion, the shockwaves pushing them forward like invisible hands. Behind them, fire advanced in perfect intervals, never speeding up, never slowing down. One explosion erupted just 50 meters behind them, showering the retreating patrol with hot shrapnel. Another blast tore through a stand of bamboo, sending razor-sharp splinters flying at lethal speed. A soldier screamed as a shard pierced his thigh, but the sergeant grabbed him by the collar and dragged him onward. "You won't survive if we stop," he yelled. The patrol's retreat became a blind scramble through firelit jungle. Some dropped their rifles, others lost their helmets. Sweat and mud streaked their faces. The roar behind them grew louder, closer, angrier. The Americans weren't firing at them specifically. They didn't have to. The barrage consumed everything in its path. The soldiers weren't fleeing from an enemy, they were fleeing from a moving wall of death. The sergeant knew they couldn't outrun artillery forever. He veered left toward a ravine, hoping the terrain would break the barrage's pattern. The patrol stumbled down the slope just as another explosion tore apart the ridge they had just abandoned. Dirt rained down on them, mixing with smoke and burning leaves. The sergeant scanned the valley below. It was glowing orange from dozens of simultaneous fires. The jungle canopy was shredded, air thick with smoke pressed against their lungs. Somewhere behind the wall of fire, American infantry marched in flawless synchronization, protected, concealed, unstoppable. The Japanese soldiers huddled in the ravine, coughing, trembling, ears ringing. The barrage continued forward up the ridge, leaving the ravine untouched, but the damage was done. Their confidence had been shattered more violently than any tree. For the first time in weeks, the men felt something stronger than fear of the enemy. They felt fear of the unknown. "What kind of artillery can walk?" one soldier whispered. "How do they move it like that?" The sergeant stared at the glowing horizon, his voice barely audible. "It's planned, timed, perfect." He swallowed hard. "This isn't just artillery, this is coordination." The Americans were controlling the battlefield with a precision the Japanese had never imagined. The walking barrage rolled on, climbing the ridge and flattening everything ahead of it. Even after the explosions moved away, the forest remained alive with fire crackling and spitting embers. Animals fled through the trees in panic. Ash drifted in the air like snow. The smell of burned wood and cordite settled over the jungle like a suffocating blanket. For several minutes after the barrage had passed, none of the patrol members spoke. They listened to the distant thunder as it moved farther into the jungle, and they realized the Americans were shaping the battlefield hour by hour, inch by inch. It was only the beginning. The next night, the walking barrage returned. Another patrol witnessed it from a different angle. They were concealed in a series of foxholes near the valley floor, observing a suspected American assembly area. The night was calm at first. Fireflies blinked softly among the roots. The sky was clouded but peaceful. Then the horizon flickered again. The Japanese corporal in charge stiffened. The men gripped their rifles tighter. Everyone recognized the pattern now. One flash, then another, then a line of fire that advanced like a living serpent. The corporal hissed, "Stay down, do not fire." But it didn't matter whether they fired or not. The barrage had a schedule, not a target. It moved in timed increments, each line of explosions falling exactly 80 yards ahead of the next. American officers had pre-sighted the terrain. They knew exactly how far infantry would advance between each artillery lift. They did not need to see the enemy. The ground exploded on the far side of the valley. 80 yards later, it exploded again. The Japanese patrol could only watch as each section of jungle, each cluster of rocks, each patch of ground was systematically erased. The corporal whispered to himself, "This is not war, this is crushing the earth itself." As the explosions approached, a young private panicked and fired his rifle wildly into the air. The corporal struck him across the face, trying to silence him, but it was too late. The muzzle flash revealed their position. And this time, the Americans had spotters watching. A single flare shot up above the tree line, glowing bright green. The barrage shifted slightly, only slightly, but enough to bring the next sequence of shells directly toward the foxhole cluster. The corporal's heart stopped. "They redirected it," he whispered in horror. The walking barrage adjusted its path. The explosions marched toward them. The first shell landed only 100 yards away, showering the foxholes with dirt and rock. The men ducked, clutching their helmets, trying to squeeze deeper into the earth. Another explosion followed closer. The foxholes shook violently. Roots snapped overhead. The air pressure made their lungs feel like they were being squeezed by invisible fists. One man broke immediately. He crawled out of the foxhole, sobbing, trying to flee into the jungle. The corporal grabbed his leg, shouting for him to stop, but the terrified soldier kicked free and sprinted into the darkness. He vanished into the next explosion. The corporal's men recoiled in horror. They had seen men die in battle before, but they had never seen someone swallowed alive by the ground itself. The barrage continued. The foxholes collapsed inward. Leaves and dirt poured onto the soldiers' backs. The corporal squeezed his eyes shut, praying the next shell would miss. He felt the heat of each blast grow closer, felt the air vibrate, felt the jungle tremble. Just as it seemed the barrage would consume them, it lifted again, advancing up the valley in relentless precision. The corporal remained frozen for a moment, unsure if he was alive or dead. When he finally looked around, he saw his men staring at him with hollow eyes. They were covered in dirt, trembling violently, their rifles half buried in mud. The men who survived were barely recognizable. Not physically, mentally. Something had broken inside them. When they returned to their unit, their report stunned their commander. Not because of the casualties, but because of what the corporal wrote at the bottom of the document. "This tactic makes the earth itself attack us. We have no defense." Across the front, similar reports emerged. Japanese officers found that patrols returning from areas hit by the walking barrage were not just shaken, they were shattered. These men were veterans, accustomed to American artillery, ambushes, and night battles, but the walking barrage was something new. It robbed them of control, robbed them of visibility, robbed them of time, robbed them of courage. One lieutenant later wrote in his diary, "Our soldiers do not fear American guns, they fear the guns that walk toward them." As the Americans refined the tactic, the psychological impact deepened. The Japanese soon discovered a more chilling truth. The walking barrage never came alone. Behind it, always hidden in the smoke, always moving in silence, American infantry advanced. Every time. And the Japanese couldn't stop them. Not because they didn't want to. Because the barrage destroyed every defensive position before the infantry arrived. Machine gun nests were flattened. Sniper positions were buried. Observation posts were obliterated. Tripwires were severed. Mines were detonated. The Japanese had always relied on jungle terrain to protect them. The walking barrage turned that terrain into dust. By the third night of the American offensive, Japanese patrols began avoiding certain sectors entirely. They marked areas on their maps as zones of fire that they dared not enter after dusk. In some units, morale broke completely. Men who once took pride in moving silently through the dark now feared the silence. Because between each explosion there was silence. And that silence was the sound of the next blast marching closer. What terrified them most was not the explosions themselves. It was the predictability. They could hear the barrage approaching. Step by step. Bang by bang. Like a giant iron foot stomping through the jungle. Coming toward them. Always toward them. Every single time. The Americans had weaponized inevitability. And in war, nothing crushes morale more effectively than inevitability. The walking barrage had begun as a tactical experiment, a calculated risk by American commanders who wanted to break the stalemated lines in the jungle. But once they realized how devastating its psychological effect was, they refined it with a precision that stunned both sides of the battlefield. Every barrage had a schedule. Every schedule had a rhythm. Every rhythm created a pattern the Japanese could recognize. And that recognition only made the fear worse. By the fourth night of continuous operations, the Japanese troops listening from the treetops or crouched in foxholes had memorized the spacing of explosions. They knew the interval between detonations. They knew how far the barrage advanced every minute. They knew exactly when the next explosion would strike the next patch of ground. And that was the problem. Knowledge should have empowered them, but instead it paralyzed them. They could hear the explosions creeping forward. Step after step after step. Each blast was a countdown. Each flash of fire was a warning. Each concussion was the jungle whispering that their time was running out. One Japanese private described it later, "The sound walked toward us, we could feel it choosing us." Whether or not the barrage was aimed directly at them didn't matter. What mattered was the sensation of helplessness, the realization that the Americans weren't firing blindly or chaotically. Their artillery moved like a machine, indifferent and unstoppable. The patrols stationed ahead of main Japanese lines began returning with identical expressions: wide eyes, pale skin, trembling hands. Men who had once volunteered eagerly for night reconnaissance now found excuses to avoid leaving camp. Officers noticed the reluctance but could do little to counter it. In many units, commanding officers tried to rebuild morale by explaining that the walking barrage was not actually walking. It was simply a series of timed lifts, coordinated with infantry advances, but the explanation did nothing. The soldiers didn't fear the mechanics. They feared the effect. And the effect was unmistakable. The barrage was destroying the very foundation of Japanese night tactics: silence, stealth, and mobility. It wasn't just about the explosions. It was about what came after. American infantry flowed behind the barrage like water following a channeled stream. They stepped over tree roots still smoking from detonations. They advanced through fogs of dust and burning leaves. They pushed into Japanese defensive zones long before Japanese officers realized the lines had been breached. The patrols sent to track American movement had no chance. By the time they reacted to the barrage, the Americans were already behind them. One night, a group of 10 Japanese scouts was positioned along a narrow ridgeline, listening to the barrage as it tore through the valley below. Their mission was to report the direction of American movement, but the barrage moved too quickly, too confidently, too perfectly. Before the scouts realized it, American troops had already reached the ridge. The scouts never even fired a shot. They were discovered huddled under fallen logs, some unconscious from concussion blasts, others staring blankly at nothing, their rifles lying unused in their laps. When interrogated later, one scout simply repeated, it walked to us." In another sector, a Japanese engineer company attempted to lay mines across a jungle clearing, hoping to slow the American advance. They worked quickly, burying explosives beneath the leaves, praying they would buy time. But the Americans were already preparing another walking barrage. As the engineers finished their work, the first artillery rounds crashed into the far end of the clearing. Dirt and foliage flew into the air. The ground convulsed under their feet. The mines they had planted detonated prematurely as explosions shook the earth, sending shrapnel into the air like broken glass. Half the engineering company fled into the jungle in blind panic. The others froze, unsure whether to run forward, backward, or sideways. Their commander tried to scream orders, but the barrage drowned out every word. American infantry marched across the clearing an hour later, stepping through a field that had already been pulverized. They encountered only abandoned equipment and the imprint of boots leading in all directions. The Japanese defenses were unraveling not from lack of courage, but from lack of control. They could no longer dictate the terms of engagement. The Americans now decided when and where the battle began, and every time the battle began with a predictable, unstoppable wave of fire. Another patrol encountered the barrage in a narrow valley. They had taken up positions behind boulders, confident that natural rock formations would shield them from direct fire. But the walking barrage didn't need to land on top of them to destroy them. The shockwaves alone were enough. Each explosion sent a powerful blast of air through the valley, bouncing off the walls and amplifying the concussive force. The patrol was overwhelmed by the pressure. Ears ruptured, eyes blurred, men collapsed to their knees, gasping for air. The sergeant tried to order a retreat, but when he opened his mouth, no sound came out. His eardrums had burst. The barrage kept advancing. Japanese soldiers curled into fetal positions behind rocks, clutching their helmets, praying for it to end. They weren't cowards, they weren't weak. They were men facing a weapon designed not just to kill bodies, but to break minds. By the time American infantry reached the valley, the Japanese patrol had fled or collapsed. The ground was littered with abandoned rifles, canteens, and shattered helmets. A few wounded men lay bleeding among the rocks, shaking uncontrollably with each distant blast. American medics found one soldier who kept repeating the same phrase in a trembling whisper: "Stop the footsteps, stop the footsteps." The Americans didn't understand, but every Japanese soldier did. Meanwhile, Japanese officers held emergency meetings across the front, desperately searching for a counter to the walking barrage. Some suggested digging deeper trenches, others recommended spreading troops farther apart, still others proposed setting ambushes behind the barrage's path. But none of the proposals addressed the real problem. By the time Japanese troops reacted, the Americans were already inside their lines. One officer proposed attacking American artillery positions directly, but the artillery was too well hidden, too well defended, and too mobile, and even if they reached it, the walking barrage could be fired from multiple batteries spread across miles of terrain. Destroying one battery wouldn't stop it. Stopping the walking barrage would require stopping all of them. And that was impossible. As days turned into weeks, the Japanese troops learned another awful truth. The walking barrage operated with terrifying consistency. It always came at the same pace, it always struck at the same depth, it always moved forward as scheduled. It marched like clockwork, like a machine, like a force of nature. One battalion commander wrote in despair, "Even if my men fight bravely, they cannot fight the earth itself." But the Americans had no intention of giving the Japanese time to recover. Once Japanese units retreated from a barrage-hit zone, American combat engineers moved in. They cleared debris, they marked safe pathways, they established footholds, they prepared new routes for infantry. And the next night, the walking barrage marched again. Japanese troops who tried to reorganize found themselves constantly disrupted by incoming fire. It was like trying to rebuild a house during an earthquake. At one point, a Japanese heavy machine gun company prepared an ambush near a bend in the river. They had the perfect position: elevated ground, concealed nests, and overlapping fields of fire. But they never used them. The walking barrage swept across the ridge in the hours before dawn. The explosions crushed the machine gun nests, buried ammunition under collapsing soil, and sent the entire company fleeing into the jungle before they ever saw an American soldier. The Americans captured the ridge without a single casualty. When they reached the machine gun nests, they found the guns still pointed toward the river, fully loaded, perfectly sighted, untouched by human hands. The Japanese had abandoned them before the Americans even appeared. It became the pattern everywhere the barrage was used. Japanese snipers left their trees. Japanese machine gunners left their bunkers. Japanese scouts abandoned their patrol routes. Japanese engineers refused to lay mines. Japanese units broke formation and ran before contact. Because everyone knew what followed the barrage: destruction, a confusion, a collapse, and behind it American infantry, calm and relentless. The longer the campaign continued, the worse morale became. One Japanese corporal confessed to his superior, "We are not afraid of the fighting, we are afraid of the moment before the fighting." He explained that Japanese soldiers could not sleep, could not eat, could not think clearly. They spent every night listening for the first blast that signaled another barrage had begun, and once it began, they knew they had only minutes before it reached them. War was no longer a battle between men. It was a battle against time. As the Americans refined their supply lines, the barrages became even more precise. They increased the number of guns participating. They synchronized barrages across wider fronts. They used aerial observers to adjust firing angles in real time. Some barrages marched as far as a mile into Japanese lines without a single misstep. And every time the barrage lifted, the Americans surged forward. The Japanese, once masters of jungle infiltration and ambush warfare, found themselves constantly pushed back, unable to regroup or strike effectively. Their tactics, once feared by Allied forces, now failed against an enemy that destroyed every inch of ground before they stepped onto it. One of the most shocking moments came when a Japanese cavalry unit, reduced to fighting on foot, attempted a night counterattack. They advanced through thick foliage, swords and rifles in hand, determined to break the American line. But they didn't reach the line. They reached the barrage. The explosions engulfed the entire unit in seconds. Horses panicked, soldiers screamed. The jungle vanished in a flash of fire and dirt. Nothing remained of the unit except twisted metal and scorched earth. American infantry arrived hours later and found hoofprints burned into the ground like ghosts. Word of the incident spread like wildfire. By the end of the week, Japanese commanders reported that entire battalions refused to conduct patrols at night in sectors where the walking barrage had been used. One commander described his troops as spiritually broken. Another wrote, "They look into the trees and see fire that has not yet arrived." Japanese soldiers weren't just terrified of being hit. They were terrified of the idea of being hit. And that fear shaped everything. They slept in shorter shifts. They ate less. They whispered among themselves about the footsteps of the barrage. They prayed for rain, mud, anything that might slow American artillery. But nothing slowed it. If the jungle was wet, the barrage churned mud into geysers. If the jungle was dry, it turned the forest into smoke. If the terrain was rocky, shockwaves shattered stone. If it was hilly, the barrage crawled uphill like a creature with claws. The Americans had found the perfect weapon for the terrain. And Japanese patrols, once confident and stealthy, were now little more than terrified observers documenting their own defeat. The Americans didn't need to hunt them. The barrage did the hunting for them. As the weeks dragged on, the walking barrage became more than a tactic. It became a presence, a rhythm that Japanese troops felt deep in their bones. Men who had survived multiple engagements could anticipate the timing of each advancing line of explosions long before it reached them. They felt the ground vibrating. They heard leaves shaking loose. They sensed the tremor that arrived just before each detonation. And yet, even with this familiarity, they were powerless. The Americans adjusted their technique constantly. Some barrages moved faster, marching across the battlefield in sudden bursts. Others slowed to allow infantry to clear obstacles. Some shifted direction mid-advance to collapse flanking trenches. Others split into two separate arms of explosions, surrounding entire Japanese units before they even realized what was happening. It was no longer a simple wall of fire. It was a shape-shifting monster that moved across the landscape with purpose. Japanese soldiers soon developed an instinctive reaction to the first blast of a barrage. Their shoulders tensed, their breathing quickened, their hands shook. Veterans who had once boasted of their ability to endure hardship now admitted privately that they dreaded the sound of distant American artillery far more than close-range combat. One soldier wrote in his diary, "I can fight a man. I cannot fight the land rising up to kill me." The walking barrage did not discriminate. It crushed everything: trees, bunkers, trenches, roots, stones, and men. Even if a soldier survived the initial blasts, the earth would often collapse around him, burying him alive or leaving him disoriented and unable to fight. By now, American commanders noticed that Japanese patrols had nearly stopped operating in certain sectors. Their absence was as obvious as the desolate landscape the barrage left behind. The Americans didn't have to guess why. They could see tracks from Japanese boots leading away from the front lines, deeper into the jungle, trying desperately to avoid the areas where artillery walked. But the Americans weren't going to stop. They continued refining the tactic, coordinating with aircraft spotters, and incorporating multiple batteries across different angles of approach. To the Japanese, the barrage now appeared to move in impossible ways. Sometimes it seemed to come from the east, sometimes from the west, sometimes from both at once. Soldiers described it as if the Americans had surrounded them with invisible lines of fire that marched in unison. A corporal in one battered unit explained to his commander, "We cannot guess where it begins anymore. We cannot guess where it ends." One night, a Japanese battalion attempted to retreat under cover of darkness. They believed the Americans were not aware of their withdrawal. They moved quietly through a narrow ravine, helping wounded men walk in single file. Officers whispered orders, trying to keep everyone silent. Then the first shells landed at the ravine's mouth. The battalion froze. The second line of explosions landed deeper inside the ravine. The walking barrage had found them. Officers shouted for the men to run, but running only forced them deeper into the path of the advancing destruction. The ravine funneled the shockwaves, amplifying each blast. Men stumbled blindly as smoke filled the air. Some tried to scramble up the ravine walls, clawing at mud and roots, only to slide back down as the next explosion hit. The barrage marched forward. The battalion disappeared. American infantry discovered the aftermath the next morning: collapsed earth, shattered rocks, broken equipment, and a twisted mass of abandoned weapons half buried in mud. They found hardly any bodies intact. The Japanese survivors who escaped its edges told a similar story. "It hunted us like we were animals." In truth, the barrage did not hunt, it simply followed a plan. But to the men on the ground, logic did not matter, the effect mattered, and the effect was devastating. Farther north, another Japanese unit tried to establish an ambush site on a ridge line overlooking an American supply route. They dug machine gun pits, laid booby traps, and camouflaged their positions with leaves and branches. It was a classic tactic that had worked many times before. But before the ambush could begin, the ridge erupted in fire. The walking barrage arrived long before American infantry did. The explosions tore apart the carefully prepared ambush positions. Machine gun crews were thrown from their pits. Camouflage nets caught fire. The ridge collapsed in several places, dropping boulders onto fleeing soldiers. The Americans hadn't planned the barrage specifically to counter an ambush. It just happened to pass through that ridge as part of a scheduled advance. Chance alone had dismantled a position that months earlier would have been deadly. By now, Japanese commanders realized they were losing not just positions, but possibilities. They could no longer stage ambushes, build machine gun nests, or conduct stealth operations. The barrage could arrive at any time in any place. Planning had become meaningless. One officer wrote in a report, "We cannot prepare for battle. The battle arrives before we do." The walking barrage changed more than tactics. It changed the terrain itself. Forests that once offered thick cover were stripped bare, the trunks blackened and splintered. Valleys that once served as defensive lines became loose soil and churned earth where foxholes collapsed under their own weight. Hillsides that once concealed snipers turned into exposed slopes where no man could hide. The Japanese had spent years mastering jungle warfare, camouflage, infiltration, mobility, deception, but the walking barrage nullified all of it. The jungle did not shield them. The darkness did not help them. The terrain did not protect them. Nothing did. In one particularly brutal night, the Americans unleashed a walking barrage followed by a second barrage offset by a few hundred meters. Japanese soldiers who survived the first wave stumbled into the path of the second. It was a deliberate tactic, staggered destruction, designed to catch defenders who fled or repositioned. The psychological result was catastrophic. Men no longer knew where safety was. They no longer trusted the terrain. They no longer trusted their instincts. A sergeant who survived the double barrage later wrote, "There was no safe direction. Forward was fire, backward was fire, staying still was fire, moving was fire." Another soldier described the experience differently. "It felt like the sky was pushing the ground against us." Meanwhile, American infantry advanced with growing confidence. Their movements were methodical, coordinated, protected by a tactic the Japanese could neither counter nor endure. Commanders noted that casualties dropped significantly in sectors where the walking barrage was used. They reached objectives faster. They captured prisoners more easily. They disrupted supply lines more effectively. And most importantly, they broke the mindset of the defenders long before reaching their positions. The Japanese, for all their discipline and courage, could not sustain morale under such constant pressure. In some units, soldiers began reporting nightmares, visions of explosions walking toward them, flash after flash, closer and closer, until everything was swallowed in fire. Men woke screaming in the middle of the night. Others refused to sleep at all, terrified of being caught unconscious by a barrage. More than one soldier confessed to his officer, "I dream of footsteps that shake the earth." Japanese high command attempted to motivate their troops with speeches about bravery and sacrifice. They issued orders demanding counter-offensives. They punished men who abandoned positions during barrages, but none of it changed the reality on the ground. American artillery dominated the battlefield. American infantry exploited every gap. The walking barrage crushed every defense. And the Japanese soldiers knew it. As the campaign neared its end, a group of American soldiers patrolling through a recently captured sector discovered a remarkable sight. An entire Japanese platoon had abandoned their weapons neatly in a straight line, as if placing them down in ceremony. The men themselves were gone, vanished into the jungle. But a note written on the back of a ration wrapper lay beneath the rifles. One sentence, a simple, quiet, terrifyingly honest. "We cannot fight the fire that walks." American officers who read the note realized something profound. The walking barrage had not just broken units, it had broken belief. It had erased the Japanese confidence that had sustained them through years of brutal warfare. The Americans continued their advance. The barrage continued its march. And the Japanese continued to retreat or fall before it. By the final days of the campaign, Japanese patrols no longer approached American lines at all. They avoided certain valleys entirely, describing them as paths of destruction. Their reports grew shorter, filled with uncertainty and dread. One of the last surviving Japanese officers to face the barrage later said, "The Americans fought with fire, but the fire did not explode, it advanced." Even decades after the war, veterans struggled to describe the psychological impact. Some refused to speak about it. Others grew visibly shaken when recalling how the explosions moved across the land with such unnatural precision. The walking barrage became one of the most feared American tactics of the Pacific Campaign, not because of the number of casualties it caused, though those were significant, but because of how completely it shattered Japanese morale, organization, and confidence. In the end, the Japanese soldiers who faced the tactic were left with an understanding that transcended strategy. The Americans had found a way to make the land itself attack. And once a soldier believes the ground is against him, the battle is already lost. Because even the bravest warrior cannot stand against footsteps of fire marching toward him, step by step, through the night.